This is Chapter 15, Psychological Disorders. In the first section, we will explore what psychological disorders are. We'll understand the problems inherent in defining the concept of psychological disorder, describe what is meant by harmful dysfunction, and identify the formal criteria that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors must meet to be considered abnormal and thus symptomatic of a psychological disorder. So psychological disorder is defined as a condition characterized by abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Psychopathology is the study of psychological disorders, including their symptoms, causes, and treatment, and the manifestation of a psychological disorder. When you see the term etiology, that's referring to the cause or the causes of a psychological disorder, and atypical describes behaviors or feelings that deviate from the norm. Cultural expectations play a large role in what we consider to be disordered or normal. So when we have these cultural expectations, violating them is not, in and of itself, a satisfactory means of identifying the presence of a psychological disorder. There do have to be other factors in place. So for example, there are some things that we would consider to be abnormal and disordered here in the US that would be considered normal and not disordered. There are also things that we consider to be abnormal but that are not considered disordered. Harmful dysfunction is a model of psychological disorders resulting from the inability of an internal mechanism to perform its natural function. The American Psychiatric Association has determined that there are significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors when there is a psychological disorder present. Disturbances reflect some kind of biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. The disturbances lead to significant distress or disability in one's life, and the disturbances do not reflect expected or culturally approved responses to certain events. So the key is that we have abnormality that creates distress and dysfunction. So it's important for all of those things to be present. So if it's just abnormality, then we may just say that the person is eccentric. But if there is abnormality with distress for the person, or in some small cases, just for the people around them, and there is disturbance in terms of dysfunction to their daily life, then we consider the behavior or the thinking process to be disordered. So we'll look now at how we diagnose and classify psychological disorders. We'll explain why classification systems are necessary, though controversial. We'll describe the basic features of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is kind of like the Bible for mental health. We'll discuss changes in the DSM over time, including criticisms of the current edition. There are many, and we'll identify which disorders are generally the most common. So this chart is in your text. It shows you the rates of disorders. And I don't have the year for this, but this is just showing you kind of over the course of a lifetime which disorders are currently in the highest rates. So major depressive disorder, this, as I said to you guys in class, has been on the rise for years in our culture. As have substance abuse disorders and anxiety disorders. Those are kind of our top disorders for our culture. So the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is an authoritative index of mental disorders and the criteria for their diagnosis. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association. The latest edition is the DSM-5, which was published in 2013. Comorbidity refers to the co-occurrence of two disorders in the same individual. So this means that they have more than one psychological disorder. Often it is substance abuse and a psychological disorder. That's very common for there to be a dual diagnosis. So the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD, is an authoritative index of mental and physical diseases and includes infectious diseases and the criteria for their diagnosis. It's published by the World Health Organization. And the compassionate view of psychological disorders is that psychological disorders represent extremes of inner experience and behavior. For example, everyone has probably felt anxiety at some time, but when we consider it to be disorder, it's just an extreme version of that feeling that most people have. And to understand that people with psychological disorders are far more than just embodiments of their disorders. They're not what someone is, but what someone has. We'll look now at perspectives on psychological disorders. We'll look at supernatural perspectives on the origin of psychological disorders. We talked a little bit about this during the first chapter. describe modern biological and psychological perspectives on the origin of psychological disorders, identify which disorders generally show the highest degree of heritability, and describe the diathesis stress model and its importance to the study of psychopathology. So supernatural describes a force beyond scientific understanding, and prior to scientific understanding, these were the models that defined how we explained pretty much everything, including mental health. So the supernatural perspective, for centuries, this is what people thought about mental illness, that the person was afflicted with possession. So it was either some type of magic that had been done, some type of witchcraft, or possession by demonic spirits. In The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, a 15th century painting by Hieronymus Bosch, a practitioner is using a tool to extract an object, the supposed stone of madness, from the head of an afflicted person. Okay? So we're no longer extracting stones of madness from the heads of people. We understand, of course, because we've had the development of science, which is extremely important, that there is an origin for behavioral cognitive dysfunction that can be clearly pinpointed and is not something that is the result of magic or monsters and demons. What's very popular and has been important in educating the public about psychological disorders is the biological perspective. This is a perspective that is still controversial, but it is helpful, as I said, because it's helped to reduce some of the stigma that people have still about psychological disorder. So the biological perspective views psychological disorders as linked to biological phenomena, such as genetic factors, chemical imbalances, and brain abnormalities. And that term, chemical imbalances, you've heard me use in class before, and you've likely heard even just socially. Again, this is a very dominant view now because it has really helped people to shift their perspective from seeing psychological disorders as something scary and unknown to seeing them as just an illness, just like any other illness that you might have in your physical system. The diathesis stress model says that people with a predisposition for a disorder or a diathesis are more likely to develop the disorder when faced with stress. So this is a model of psychopathology that very clearly takes into account nature and nurture. So they're saying that for a psychological disorder, that if someone has a genetic predisposition, meaning that there is a family history of psychological disorder, and they are placed under stressful environmental conditions, that the combination of those two, that diathesis and stress, could then result in the development of a psychological disorder. So we'll look now at anxiety disorders. We'll distinguish between normal anxiety and pathological anxiety. We'll list and describe the major anxiety disorders, including their main features and prevalence. We'll describe basic psychological and biological factors that are suspected to be important in the etiology of anxiety disorder. An anxiety disorder is characterized by excessive and persistent fear and anxiety and by related disturbances in behavior. Major anxiety disorders include specific phobias, social anxiety disorders, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. Specific phobia is an anxiety disorder characterized by excessive, distressing, and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation. So if someone is afraid of snakes, that would be an example of a specific phobia. Agoraphobia is an anxiety disorder characterized by intense fear, anxiety, and avoidance of situations in which it might be difficult to escape if one experiences symptoms of a panic attack. The acquisition of phobias through learning are believed to be through classical conditioning, vicarious learning, and verbal transmission, meaning that we might be able to acquire these phobias through classical conditioning, as you've learned about, and you can understand how that process works. Remember Pavlov's dogs and baby Albert, okay? And vicarious learning. So we might develop a phobia by either seeing someone else have a scary experience or even just learning about it through verbal transmission. Social anxiety disorder is characterized by extreme and persistent fear or anxiety and avoidance of social situations in which one could potentially be evaluated negatively by others. Safety behaviors include mental and behavioral acts designed to reduce anxiety in social situations by reducing the chance of negative social outcomes, and they're common in social anxiety disorder. Some examples of safety behavior include assuming roles in social situations that minimize interaction with others. So you can see if these seem familiar for your experience. asking people many questions to keep the focus off of oneself, selecting a position to avoid scrutiny or contact with others, wearing bland neutral clothes to avoid drawing attention to yourself, avoiding substances or activities that might cause anxiety symptoms such as caffeine, warm clothing, and physical exercise. Panic disorder is an anxiety disorder that's characterized by unexpected panic attacks, along with at least 1 month of worry about panic attacks or self-defeating behavior related to the attacks. A panic attack is a period of extreme fear or discomfort that develops abruptly. The symptoms of the panic attacks are both physiological and psychological. It is essentially the fight or flight being activated, but again, just from fear, okay? Not an immediate danger. Generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by a continuous state of excessive, uncontrollable, and pointless worry and apprehension. What's key about generalized anxiety disorder is that unlike specific phobias or agoraphobia or the previous things I've talked about, there is nothing to pinpoint the sensation, the physiological and the psychological experiences of anxiety to. So they are anxious generally, which is why it's called generalized anxiety disorder. Look now at obsessive compulsive and related disorders. These are arguably extensions of anxiety disorders, but they have their own classification. So we'll describe the main features and prevalence of obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and hoarding disorder. We'll understand some of the factors in the development of obsessive compulsive disorder. So obsessive compulsive disorder, commonly referred to as OCD, is characterized by the tendency to experience intrusive and unwanted thoughts and urges, obsessions, and or the need to engage in repetitive behaviors or mental acts, compulsions, in response to the unwanted thoughts and urges. So the cycle goes that there are the mental obsessions, okay? Those mental obsessions create anxiety, and then there is a compulsion to perform a behavior that will create relief for that anxiety until the obsessions come back again. Some common obsessions include concern about germs and contamination, order and symmetry, and urges that are aggressive or lustful. People are, usually used to thinking of OCD as people having things really neat. That obviously would be the obsession of order and symmetry, but make sure that you understand that the obsessions could be about anything, okay? The compulsions are repeated and extensive hand washing for concerns about germs and contamination, ordering for concerns about order and symmetry, and counting, praying, or reciting something to oneself is typically the compulsions that follow urges that are aggressive or lustful. Look at some related disorders. Obsessive compulsive and related disorders are a group of overlapping disorders that are listed in the DSM-5. They involve intrusive, unpleasant thoughts and or repetitive behaviors. So body dysmorphic disorder involves excessive preoccupation with an imagined defect in physical appearance. And hoarding disorder is characterized by persistent difficulty in parting with possessions, regardless of their actual value or usefulness. Look at the causes of OCD. There's believed to be some genetic components, so they're 5 times more frequent in first-degree relatives. The orbital frontal cortex is an area of the frontal lobe involved in learning and decision-making, so it's believed that in people with OCD, the orbital frontal cortex becomes especially hyperactive when they're provoked with tasks that provoke the obsessions. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something that you're likely very familiar with. It does not just affect our servicemen and servicewomen. So we'll look at the nature and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll identify the risk factors associated with the disorder and understand the role of learning and cognitive factors in its development. So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is experiencing a profoundly traumatic event that leads to a constellation of symptoms that include intrusive and distressing memories of the event, avoidance of stimuli connected to the event, negative emotional states, feelings of detachment from others, irritability, proneness toward outburst, hypervigilance, and a tendency to startle easily. And these symptoms must occur for at least 1 month. Flashbacks are a common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they are psychological states that are lasting from a few seconds to several days, during which one relives a traumatic event and behaves as though the event were occurring at that moment. Some risk factors for PTSD include trauma experience, lack of immediate social support, more subsequent life stress, traumatic events that involve harm by others versus ones that do not, female gender, low socioeconomic status, low intelligence, personal history of mental disorders, and history of childhood adversity. Support for sufferers of PTSD, it can come in the form of social support, through comfort, advice, and assistance from others, and of course, professional support. Learning and the development of PTSD in classical conditioning could be part of the way that this can develop into a disorder. It can also be a part of treatment strategy. And two key processes are crucial: disturbances in memory for the event, and negative appraisals of the trauma and its aftermath. Look now at mood disorders. We'll distinguish normal states of sadness and euphoria from states of depression and mania, describe the symptoms of major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, understand the differences between major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder, and identify two subtypes of depression, and define the criteria for a manic episode. We'll also understand genetic, biological, and psychological explanations of major depressive disorder, and discuss the relationship between mood disorders and suicidal ideation, as well as factors associated with suicide. Mood disorders are one of a group of disorders that are characterized by severe disturbances in mood and emotions. The categories of mood disorders listed in the DSM-5 are bipolar and related disorders and depressive disorders. Depressive disorders are one of a group of mood disorders in which depression is the defining feature, and bipolar and related disorders are a group of mood disorders in which mania is the defining feature. And mania is defined as a state of extreme elation and agitation. So major depressive disorder is commonly referred to as depression or major depression. It's characterized by sadness or loss of pleasure in usual activities, as well as other symptoms. To receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, an individual has to experience a total of 5 symptoms for at least a 2-week period. So there has to be one of these 5, at least 5 of these rather, for at least 2 weeks. Significant change in weight or appetite, difficulty falling asleep or sleeping too much, psychomotor agitation or psychomotor retardation. This means that physically you're either agitated, so that's hyperactivity, or that your physical activity is really, really slow. So sometimes we'll see that people with depression move in very extremely slow ways, or that they are moving too quickly. Okay. Fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty concentrating, and indecisiveness. Suicidal ideation is the having thoughts of death, not just the fear of dying, but actively thinking about dying. And thinking about or planning suicide or making an actual suicide attempt. So the results of major depressive disorder are having a profoundly miserable existence, an unavailability for work or education, an abandonment of promising careers or lost wages, hospitalization, discrimination, health issues, and in the case of course, suicidal ideation, there is the possibility of death. Suicidal ideation and depression do not always go together, but when people have suicidal ideation, they are almost always depressed. Risk factors for major depressive disorder include that they're more common in women. Younger people report more than older people, and depression is actually on the rise right now for adolescents and young adults. Unemployment, poverty, living in urban areas, and being divorced or widowed. So there's some subtypes of depression. You may have heard of some of these. They include seasonal pattern, peripartum onset, and persistent depressive disorder. Seasonal pattern is a subtype of depression in which a person experiences the symptoms of major depressive disorder only during a particular time of year. So you may have heard of seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, okay? And that's common during the winter months. Peripartum onset or postpartum depression is a subtype of depression that applies to women who experience an episode of major depression either during pregnancy or in the 4 weeks following childbirth. And persistent depressive disorder is a depressive disorder characterized by a chronically sad and melancholy mood. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder characterized by mood states that vacillate between depression and mania. A manic episode is a period in which an individual experiences mania, characterized by extremely cheerful and euphoric mood, excessive talkativeness, irritability, increased activity levels, and other symptoms. Some risk factors for bipolar disorder, it's higher in men than in women. The onset is usually around the age of 25, and comorbidity, so that remember that means that there is another diagnosis in place. There's a high suicide rate, so about 36% of people diagnosed attempt suicide and 15 to 19% complete suicide. So looking at the biological basis of mood disorders, this should be a little bit of review because again, we did cover this in biopsychology, at least the foundation for it. So there's strong genetic and biological basis for mood disorders. Imbalances in neurotransmitters, specifically norepinephrine and serotonin. Depression is linked to abnormalities in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and there are abnormal levels of cortisol, which is, again, the stress hormone. Stressful life events can trigger depression, so significant losses, the death of a loved one, divorce or separation, and serious health and money problems. Traumatic events during childhood, so separation from a parent, family turmoil, and maltreatment. Not everyone who has these events succumbs to depression. And again, when we're looking at all of these, we're looking at the clinical level depression. Everyone does, of course, occasionally feel down, as we say, but when we are seeing that that is persistent, and again, at least 5 of those criteria that I talked about earlier, then we're talking about depression at a disordered or clinical level. So some cognitive theories of depression. Depression is triggered by a cognitive vulnerability, so negative and maladaptive thinking. Hopelessness theory is a cognitive theory of depression that proposes that a style of thinking that perceives negative life events as having stable and global causes will lead to a sense of hopelessness and then to depression. And rumination in depression is a tendency to repetitively and passively dwell on one's depressed symptoms, their meanings, and their consequences. So it creates, again, one of these cycles. You guys know I like these cyclical kind of displays. So if there's a stressful event and the person has a negative attribution, this is appraisal, right? So the way they're seeing the event is negative, and especially if they're seeing it as global and permanent, meaning that the situation is not going to change and it's not just this isolated situation, but now it's their entire life that's negative. That obviously leads to feelings of sadness and hopelessness, which creates depression. And if we are in a depressed state, then that is more likely that we are going to experience stressful events. And the more we experience those stressful events, the more likely it is that we're going to engage in that negative attribution, and so on and so on. So suicide is death caused by intentional, self-directed, injurious behavior. It's the 10th leading cause of death for all ages as of 2010. There were 38,364 suicides in 2010. It's about 105 each day. Men are 4 times more likely to complete suicide than women. And there was some misconception about why this was for many years, and then they realized that men tend to use more lethal methods. So 79% are firearm related. Between 1991 and 2003, suicide rates were higher among 65-year-olds. The highest rates are among American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and non-Hispanic whites. And the highest rates consistently are found in the mountain states of the West in our country. Some risk factors for suicide include alcoholism or other substance abuse, prior attempts, a sense of entrapment, which includes cyberbullying, social contagion. So this means that when we are exposed to, especially someone close to us who has committed suicide, so a family member, a friend, or someone even just our immediate community, that it increases our likelihood. And then media coverage of suicide and serotonin dysfunction. Look now at schizophrenia, which is the most severe of psychological disorders. By the end of the section, we'll recognize the essential nature of schizophrenia, avoiding the misconception that it involves a split personality, categorize and describe the major symptoms of schizophrenia, understand the interplay between genetic, biological, and environmental factors that are associated with the development of schizophrenia, and discuss the importance of research examining prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a severe disorder characterized by major disturbances in thought, perception, emotion, and behavior, with symptoms that include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking and behavior, and negative symptoms. Hallucination is a perceptual experience that occurs in the absence of external stimulation, such as the auditory hallucinations or hearing voices that are common in schizophrenia. Delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality. That means they're in opposition to reality, and they're firmly held despite contradictory evidence. Paranoid delusions are characterized by beliefs that others are out to harm. Grandiose delusions are characterized by beliefs that one holds special power, unique knowledge, or is extremely important. And somatic delusions are beliefs that something highly unusual is happening within one's own body. Disorganized thinking is disjointed and incoherent thought processes that are usually detected by what a person says. So there's a very distinctive pattern of speech typically for schizophrenics that sometimes is referred to as kind of a word salad, where their thoughts are incoherent and jump from topic to topic within the span of a single sentence. Disorganized or abnormal motor behavior is highly unusual behaviors and movements, such as childlike behaviors, repeated and purposeless movements, and displaying odd facial expressions and gestures. Catatonic behaviors are decreased reactivity to the environment, including posturing and catatonic stupor. And negative symptoms are characterized by decreases in absences in certain normal behaviors, emotions or drives, such as an expressionless face, a lack of motivation to engage in activities, reduced speech, lack of social engagement, and an inability to experience pleasure. Schizophrenia is largely believed to be influenced by genetics, so a combination of genes and environment. We can see that there is also abnormal neurotransmitter activity, as is the case with most psychological disorders. So the dopamine hypothesis is a theory of schizophrenia that proposes that an overabundance of dopamine or dopamine receptors is responsible for the onset and maintenance of schizophrenia. In brain anatomy, schizophrenics do have enlarged ventricles, so we can see that there are some differences there. We can also see that there is a connection between the mothers of people who have schizophrenia and having flu during pregnancy, during a kind of key phase during pregnancy. Also, if they're more likely to use marijuana. And then schizophrenia early warning signs include prodromal symptoms. So in schizophrenia, these are one of the early minor symptoms of psychosis. Looking at dissociative disorders, these include what people socially usually refer to as multiple personality disorder. It's not a term used within psychology anymore, though. So we'll describe the essential nature of dissociative disorders, identify and differentiate the symptoms of dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, derealization disorder, and dissociative identity disorder. We'll discuss the potential role of both social and psychological factors in dissociative identity disorder. So dissociative disorders are a group of DSM-5 disorders in which the primary feature is that a person becomes dissociated or split off from his or her core sense of self, resulting in disturbances in identity and memory. Dissociative amnesia is a dissociative disorder characterized by an inability to recall important personal information, usually following an extremely stressful or traumatic experience. Dissociative fugue is a symptom of dissociative amnesia, in which a person suddenly wanders away from one's home and experiences confusion about his or her identity. Sometimes that resolves itself within days, weeks, sometimes it takes a couple of years. Depersonalization or derealization disorder is a dissociative disorder in which people feel detached from the self. And this is actually on the rise. There have been really high rates of diagnosis for depersonalization or derealization disorder in adolescents over the last couple of years. And so there's this sense that the world feels artificial and unreal in the derealization part of this, which is the higher of the adolescent diagnosis. So dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is what we formerly referred to as multiple personality disorder. Socially, people tend to still use this term, but it's not used within psychology anymore. It's when a person exhibits two or more distinct, well-defined personalities or identities and experiences memory gaps for the time during which another identity emerged. They give us a picture here of Split, which is a film that came out a couple of years ago, was it a year or two ago, and has a very dramatized depiction of dissociative identity disorder, as is usually the case. The rates of diagnosis for this were kind of high during the 70s, and that's for many reasons, but it became kind of a trendy diagnosis, and what we find now is that this is very rare. So it is an actual diagnosis. It is an experience, a disorder that someone can have, but it is also very rare. We'll look now at personality disorders, which are not so rare. We'll describe the nature of personality disorders and how they differ from other disorders, list and distinguish between the three clusters of personality disorders, and identify the basic features of borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, and the factors that are important in the etiology of both. So personality disorders are a group of DSM-5 disorders that are characterized by an inflexible and pervasive personality style that differs markedly from the expectations of one's culture and causes distress and impairment. People with these disorders have a personality style that frequently brings them into conflict with others and disrupts their ability to develop and maintain social relationships. So the DSM-5 recognizes 10 personality disorders, and they're organized into 3 different clusters. Under cluster A, we've got paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Under cluster B, we have antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Under cluster C, we have avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is not the same thing as OCD. So there's a chart in your book that helps you to kind of distinguish among the clusters, okay? So paranoid personality disorder, this is when a person harbors a pervasive and unjustifiable suspiciousness and mistrust of others, the reluctance to confide in or become close to others. They read hidden demeaning or threatening meaning into benign remarks or events, and they take offense easily and bear grudges, not due to schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. Schizoid personality disorder is when a person lacks interest and desire to form relationships with others. They're aloof and show emotional coldness and detachment. They're indifferent to approval or criticism of others. They lack close friends or confidants. They're not due to, and again, this is not due to schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, and they're not on the autism spectrum disorder. Schizotypal personality disorder is when a person exhibits eccentricities in thought, perception, emotion, speech, and behavior, shows suspiciousness or paranoia. They have unusual perceptual experiences. Their speech is often idiosyncratic. They display inappropriate emotions, lack friends or confidants. And again, this is not due to schizophrenia or any other psychotic disorder, and they're not on the autism spectrum disorder. Under cluster B, we have again antisocial, histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline. Antisocial personality disorder is when a person continuously violates the rights of others. The history of antisocial tendencies predates the age of 15. They often lie, fight, and have problems with the law, impulsive, and fail to think ahead. They can be deceitful and manipulative in order to gain profit or pleasure. They're irresponsible and often fail to hold down a job or pay financial debts. And they lack feelings for others and remorse over their misdeeds. For histrionic personality disorder, the person is excessively overdramatic, emotional, and theatrical. They feel uncomfortable when they're not the center of others' attention. Their behavior is often inappropriately seductive or provocative. Their speech is highly emotional, but often vague and diffuse. Their emotions are shallow and often shift rapidly, and they may alienate friends with demands for constant attention. A narcissistic personality disorder is having an overinflated and unjustified sense of self-importance and a preoccupation with fantasies of success. The person believes that he's entitled to special treatment from others, and they show arrogant attitudes and behaviors and take advantage of others. They lack empathy. Borderline personality disorder is when a person is unstable in self-image, mood, and behavior. They cannot tolerate being alone and experience chronic feelings of emptiness. They're unstable in intense relationships with others. They have behavior that is impulsive, unpredictable, and sometimes self-damaging, and they show inappropriate and intense anger. They make suicidal gestures. And finally, in cluster C, for avoidant personality disorder, the person is socially inhibited and oversensitive to negative evaluation. They avoid occupations that involve interpersonal contact because of fears of criticism or rejection. They avoid relationships with others unless guaranteed to be accepted unconditionally. They feel inadequate and view themselves as socially inept and unappealing, and they're unwilling to take risks or engage in new activities if they may prove embarrassing. For dependent personality disorder, the person allows others to take over and run their life. They're submissive, clingy, and they fear separation. They cannot make decisions without advice and reassurance from others. They lack self-confidence. They cannot do things on their own. They feel uncomfortable or helpless when alone. And for obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which again is distinguished from OCD, there's a pervasive need for perfectionism that interferes with the ability to complete tasks. There's a preoccupation with details, rules, order, and schedules, and there's an excessive devotion to work at the expense of leisure and friendships. They tend to be rigid and flexible and stubborn and insist that things be done in their own way and are miserly with money. So again, borderline personality disorder and instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, mood, as well as impulsivity. A depiction of this, you'll find a depiction for almost every psychological disorder in Hollywood was in Girl Interrupted. Okay? The biological basis for borderline personality disorder is believed to be some genetic factors. So again, if there's a family history that increases predisposition, and then childhood trauma. Again, for antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a lack of regard for others' rights, impulsivity, deceitfulness. Okay, we see lots of depictions of this in film as well. Men with antisocial personality disorder are more likely than women with antisocial personality disorder to do things that could easily hurt themselves or others, receive 3 or more traffic tickets for reckless driving, have their driver's license suspended, destroy others' property, start a fire on purpose, make money illegally, do anything that could lead to arrest, hit someone hard enough to injure them, and hurt an animal on purpose. Women with antisocial personality disorder are more likely than men with anti-personality disorder to run away from home overnight, frequently miss school or work, lie frequently, forge someone's signature, get into a fight that comes to blows with an intimate partner, live with others besides the family for at least 1 month, and harass, threaten, or blackmail someone. So this is a chart that's in your book. Do take some time to look at it. It gives some risk factors during adolescence that can predict later violence. We'll look now at disorders in childhood. Rates of childhood psychological disorder have been increasing over the last several years as well, and it's controversial, and some of that may be part of cultural changes, and some of that may be the result of actual shifts. So we'll describe the nature and symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder. We'll discuss the prevalence and factors that contribute to the development of these disorders. Neurodevelopmental disorders involve developmental problems in personal, social, academic, and intellectual functioning. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is a childhood disorder characterized by inattentiveness and/or hyperactive impulsive behavior. And the autism spectrum disorder is a childhood disorder characterized by deficits in social interaction and communication and repetitive patterns of behavior or interest. Some life problems that can result from ADHD are having worse educational attainment. They're more likely to have dropped out of high school and less likely to have earned a bachelor's degree. Having lower socioeconomic status, having less prestigious occupational positions, being more likely to be unemployed, making considerably less in salary, being scored worse on a measure of occupational functioning, being scored worse on a measure of social functioning, and being more likely to be divorced, and finally more likely to have non-alcohol related substance abuse problems. Genetics, again, is believed to be a contributing factor for ADHD. Specific genes that are involved in the regulation of the neurotransmitter dopamine are believed to have abnormal functioning. And then abnormalities in the brain, including less volume in the frontal lobe, and poor parenting is not believed to be a cause. For autism spectrum disorder, childhood, again, disorder characterized by deficits in social interaction and communication, there are typically disturbances in 3 major areas for autism spectrum disorder. So social interaction, communication, and then those repetitive patterns of behavior or interest. Some life problems that are experienced for people with autism spectrum disorder, it typically appears early in life, so childhood. They tend not to make eye contact and prefer playing alone. Communication deficits can range from a complete lack of speech to one-word responses to echoed speech to difficulty maintaining a conversation. So there is a range or a spectrum. Problems using and understanding nonverbal cues, repetitive behaviors including rocking, head banging, dropping, and picking up objects. Highly restricted and fixated interests that appear abnormal in intensity. And Asperger's syndrome was dropped and is now included in the spectrum. So you may have heard of that as kind of a distinct part, but now it is included in the full autism spectrum. 1 in 88 children in the US is diagnosed with autism. Causes are believed to again be genetics, gene mutations in particular, genes that are important in the formation of the synaptic circuits that facilitate communication